everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Chloe and I work in our Badenoch Clark Brighton office alongside Louise Sorrell and Sarah Robinson. As a team, we recruit HR professionals across Surrey and Sussex. For those of you who have attended our HR seminars and events in the past, you'll know how much we enjoy running them and being able to meet you all face to face. And we hope to be able to start running them again next year when we're allowed to. But for now, like many of you, we've had to adapt, and we've adapted our ways of working over Teams and Zoom. So we really hope that you enjoy our webinar today. We're really excited to be able to team up with our local law specialists, Abby and Adam from DMH Stallard. We're going to provide you with some up-to-date information on Agile Working and the furlough scheme. So we hope you enjoy the webinar, and I'm going to hand you over now to Abby and Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Chloe said, I'm Abigail Maino, a Senior Associate at DMH Stallard. Adam Williams, my colleague, and I will be looking at Agile Working and the future of work today. Agile Working encompasses a variety of matters. It's a huge topic, from technology to processes to the jobs themselves. We'll be looking at the people side of things in this session. And it's also the case that Agile Working means many different things to different people. What we'll look at is what we've learnt over the past few months, both good and bad, and how that might shape things going forward. Adam will be looking at the Agile Working and what it means, and then I'll look at some of the legal issues, and then we'll move on to look at the extended furlough scheme and some other options. Before I hand over to Adam, just a few bits of housekeeping. There'll be a chat box on your screen somewhere, either at the top or the bottom. Please use that for any technical issues that you encounter during the webinar. If you have a question, there'll be a Q&A box as well. Please put your question in there and then we can see them, and hopefully we can answer as many of those as we can through the session. If we don't get round to answering those, then we will be putting together a Q&A sheet after the session that we'll send out to you. So don't worry if your question isn't answered during the session, you will get an answer. There'll be a couple of short polls during the session. And if you're watching on a smartphone, you may need to scroll down to the bottom to submit your answer. What I'll do now is hand over to Adam to have a look at what Agile Working means.
Thanks, Abby. Good morning, everybody. So I get to look at the higher level, bigger picture issue starting off this morning for everybody, touching on the issue of trying, it's not an easy task, but trying to define what Agile Working is. And one of the tricky bits there is how to distinguish it from flexible working. And when looking at that, I thought I would take a quote from a company called the Agile Organization, with no particular affiliation with our firm, but they are a consultant practice, as I understand it, specializing in supporting businesses with adopting Agile Working. So you can have a read of that quote there just for a couple of seconds. And I think the point that comes out for me from that, in terms of identifying the distinction between Agile Working and other working arrangements like flexible, is that point at the end there about particular task. And I think that is a key distinction. When we think about flexible working, we think about an agreed variation in the way and how and when someone works as a sort of structural thing. Whereas I think one helpful distinction in our minds will be that when we talk about Agile Working, in fact, it's actually possibly key distinguishing feature is that it's more in real time. It's about how dynamic we are in dealing with particular tasks and projects that arise during the course of our working time, how we adapt to them, how much autonomy we give our people in dealing with them and making decisions on when they should be done, how they should be done, and where they should be done, in fact. So if we move on to the next slide, that's really what we're going to be looking at today, and trying to keep that separation between flexible and Agile Working. I'm going to look at flexible working later in the session as a recap of the framework that sits there. But in terms of Agile Working, drawing out some of those distinctions, we talk about flexible working in terms of arrangements that suit an employee's needs, typically. So start and finish times, working from home. It's about when and where a lot of the time. But Agile Working might include elements of flexible working, but a lot more than that, as we've talked about in terms of the way in which we work in real time, day to day. So it might be about empowerment, about saying individuals are now going to have the ability to make these decisions or adjust their own working lives in this way and how they deliver on their role. Choice around how they do that. It might be actually technology driven to some degrees in terms of optimization of processes and performance, and connectivity. How are we going to interact in a way that makes us more dynamic and more able to respond to changing events, which of course we've all got very used to having to do in quite a profound and exceptional way in the last few months. So moving forward, let's look at the position as it was pre-COVID, just briefly. And I think it's fair to say that Agile working in sort of any material sense was seen as something of a sort of blue sky project. Employers were talking about it. It was an HR hot topic for certain discussions, but not something that was widely adopted in this sense of just empowering individuals to decide how and when they deliver on their job. And so we'd seen limited take up on it. There were, as there always is in HR and in employers, some vanguards of it who'd come out and sort of wanted to be a leader in the field. And we started to see that around holiday rights, didn't we? And the ability to take away any limit on the amount of holiday employees might take and when they take them, which is pointing towards that thing of empowering individuals to control their working lives and trusting them to make the right decisions. But the take-up's been limited, I think, in part by concerns from management. And that might be twofold. That might be at the top level of management, a concern about actually, is it a step too far, the agile arrangements we're talking about in terms of empowering our individuals? Is there risk associated with that? But it also might be, if you're a manager, looking at yourself and saying, well, if we empower our people to do all these things, where does that leave me? What is my role as a manager if there are all these new facets of the role that individuals are just being masters of their own destiny for? And perhaps there's a bit of a lack of understanding that comes into that, maybe internally, in terms of how it would work and what the checks and balances might be. And we'll come on later to thinking about those checks and balances. How can you make agile working successful, but also safe in terms of managing risks that go with the fluidity of it? So then we hit lockdown from March, and we had the crisis management, obviously, in late March, once full lockdown hits. And we're focused very much on adapting to the new arrangement. And it's quite interesting when you think of agile working sort of sitting in the background, but the old saying of necessity being the mother of all invention. We suddenly need, certainly, to get flexible, because we're all told to work from home unless we can't possibly do that. And we probably also have to, or possibly want to, get agile in the way we work alongside that. So we were in crisis management mode in March. We were looking at health of staff, looking at continuity of service in terms of, perhaps in the negative sense, have people got service around redundancy rights if we need to make headcount reductions? How do we keep people engaged? And there was a race to prepare to work from home. And of course, we didn't have the luxury of thinking long and hard in advance about pros and cons, risk reward, how we're going to nice and neatly agree all these arrangements with staff, get them set up with a home working arrangement, and think about all the other practical issues like insurance. Now, because for many employers, maybe those things happen to be in place already. For others, it was a big change, and we were playing catch up. So that's what happened with lockdown. Moving through that, obviously, we've come to get comfortable, I think, that may not be the right word, but certainly used to the different working arrangements. Many businesses have a large proportion, if not a majority, of people working from home most of the time. And so before we move forward, I just want to ask about and get a sense of whether you've introduced new forms of agile working since March, either inadvertently or consciously, or you think it's likely that you will in the near future. So yes, no on the poll there, if you can let us know whether you have or are going to introduce agile working. So we just wait for the results to come back. Wow, okay, so 84% are saying yes, And I thought we'd have a majority saying yes, but that's overwhelming, which is really interesting to see. Well, that's great. So you obviously come to a session that's you're in the right place for talking it through today. Happily, it's not the other way around, and everybody's saying no, we're not looking at agile working at all. In which case, we can move on to later parts of the session. But so an overwhelming majority of looking at this. No doubt that in part is to do with the benefits that we've seen. There's been lots of downsides to lockdown, but we've seen benefits as well, I'm sure. Some examples of those are around productivity and time efficiencies if you're agile. People have inevitably adapted their working day and been more creative, I suspect, in terms of how they work and when they work, and adapting so that they're as productive as they can be at the times when they're working. And that's part of agile working, in my view. In an extreme example, you might find that because your technology systems support it, without anybody necessarily knowing, certain steps in your processes within your organization are being done by somebody on their work app while they're at the school gates picking up their kids from school. There's all different manners and ways in which it might happen, but it means that if you take that example, perhaps the next step in the process happens straight away, rather than previously where it might have had to wait until that person got back home, was logged back in formally working, and was able to then press authorize and move that process on. Another benefit is the ease of home working. Sometimes it's a very different picture depending on your home circumstances on that. But sometimes when you look at the balance of commuting, office environment as to home, it may be easier. We're all able to potentially do productive work when we would have otherwise been commuting if we've cut that out of our days. There's been an acceptance of remote working as legitimate. Some of that fear factor has fallen away a little bit, I think, as a result of lockdown. I think if you'd asked employers whether they were happy to just try and be an experiment of an arrangement where they just ask everybody to work from home without prior notice, most of us, if not all of us, would have said, no, I don't like the idea of that experiment, because we fear the unknown and that it might be terrible and go horribly wrong. And whilst we've had challenges, I think that people have looked at it and thought it's actually worked. We've got through it. It's been difficult at times, but those fears we had about issues that might arise, people going off the grid, we can't find them, are they working, haven't materialized in the way we might have feared. Technology seems to be coping. We've got obviously video webinars and calls like this one that have become prevalent, and virtual meetings linked with that has happened as well. And of course, there is a potential cost saving for a business in terms of office space, and we could do a whole separate session on the future of the office. What is that going to mean? Which is like a follow-on from Agile in a way. So we know there are benefits potentially from it. There is obviously a necessary recognition of downsides for this. It doesn't work for everyone. When we talk about the ease of home working, for some people, that home working environment will not be ideal. Or indeed the job that they do or the way in which they work isn't conducive necessarily to the home working environment. There's also an issue around confidence in the sense of both the employer and the employee. The employer needs to have that confidence and trust that if they're empowering the individual to control their day and decide how they do work and when and with who, they need to feel that they can be confident in that. The employee equally needs to feel confident in their own ability to do that. And I suspect also in most scenarios needs to feel there is still a basis on which to get support, management support, if they're moving outside of their comfort zone. Mental health issues that are linked to any challenges being faced at the moment, or the lack of direct face-to-face social interaction at work. Everybody's responding differently to that. It is a risk and an issue that needs to be kept in mind. Workplace collaboration, certainly internally when I've been looking at this situation for our office in the Guildford office, one of the things we've lost through lockdown has been the spontaneous face-to-face interaction, obviously, in the office. How do we try to adapt to that, and how do we avoid losing all of that through agile working? It's a challenge. It's something to work through. Culture fit is a similar thing. Workplace culture. How do we maintain that? And for new joiners, I suspect the challenges or the abilities of agile working are stretched to their fullest at that point, if you're bringing somebody into the business, but who actually won't necessarily be face to face with anybody and has to get used to autonomy in the way they deliver their role from the off. And I think perhaps there's an element of planning and saying, we don't go to full agile mode from day one with employees, just like we have inductions. We need to work out in stages through a life cycle of employment when agile working should be introduced and to what degree. All things to think about on the practical side there. So moving forward, agile working post-COVID, vast majority of either implemented it or looking at it. It may be that we need to look at it. You know, what are our competitors doing? Is it actually the way that we get competitive advantage? We can become more productive, more dynamic, more profitable. And what about the opportunities and challenges? We're not necessarily looking at this to reduce headcount, although productivity can mean that you need less people. But actually, is it about actually just optimizing same people, delivering more in the same amount of time? And over time, maybe that we need to develop policies, maybe industry-based policies around things like health and safety, thinking about practical issues like insurance, but also in terms of broad codes of practice in how to manage agile working. Lots to think about, exciting stuff. And I think now, if we just move forward, we're going to look at the difficult bit, which I'm very happy to hand over to Abigail for, on the legal rather than practical and contextual considerations for agile working.
Thanks, Adam. That was really helpful. Yeah, the rapid pace of change in 2020 has been overwhelmingly dealt very well, I think, by employers and employees. But we're now moving to the next phase, I think, of thinking, do we want some of these things to be permanent changes? And if we do, how do we go about doing that? And what are the things we need to consider in the context of our legal obligations? So I'll now have a look at some of the considerations once you've agreed a process or way of working and you want to formalise that with your employees. So getting right back to basics and contract law, it's I think quite easy for us to forget that largely employers and employees can agree any form of agile working or flexible working that they want to, subject to some basic things that the law will imply and minimum standards. But the key is to get it documented in a contract to record the agreement that's been reached between the parties. And as a reminder, on the slide there, to be a contract, there has to be an intention to create those legal relations. And there has to be some offer and acceptance. Now, typically, that comes from the employer to the employee, but not necessarily the case. It could come from the employee to the employer, and that's something to watch out for, not in a bad way, but just to be alive to as we come out of this lockdown situation. You may get employees coming and suggesting different ways of working that managers may agree to because it's been working, and you may have then some contract or contractual relation off the back of that. There also needs to be consideration between the parties. That typically is employers working in return for being paid, but it doesn't have to be monetary. And there needs to be certainty. So if a judge looks at the contract, he or she needs to be able to work out what it says and what the intention was. But once you have that, you have a binding contract. But as I say, the law recognises that there are some inequalities of bargaining power between employer and employee. So there are certain minimum things that are implied or have to be into contracts. And I've set out on the slide some of the more common ones that will apply in the context of agile working. National minimum wage, of course, has to be paid to a worker. And if it isn't, then the agreement is void. A Section 1 statement needs to be provided as well at the outset of employment. And you'll be aware that from April this year, that has to be given to both employees and workers. And that has to set out various minimum terms of the engagement. So certain things need to be in the principal statement to be given at the time the work commences, and certain things can be in follow-up documents. But it's things like hours of work, rates of pay, holiday, things that might not naturally sit comfortably with agile working if we want that autonomy to be given to individuals. And so there'll be a little bit of work around how you can comply with that section 1 statement and the detail that needs to be given, whilst also recognising that the concept of agile working and that empowerment of individuals is to give them some freedom in the way they work. So the two don't necessarily sit comfortably together, but I think that they can be worked through with some creative thinking. There's minimum working hours or maximum working hours and rest breaks. So there's a 48-hour limit on the working week, although that can be opted out of, and also various rest breaks that individuals must take throughout the day when they work for minimum periods of time. And again, in the context of agile working, how is that going to be monitored by the employer, and what systems and processes are going to be in place to ensure that these things are being carried out. The law won't recognise excessive restrictive covenants, as we all know. And I think in the context of a dispersed workforce, there's going to need to be some thought given as to what are the legitimate business interests of the employer when seeking to restrict the individuals. So, for example, is it going to be appropriate going forward to have restricted areas in which employees can't work for a period of time if you are getting talent from across the country, maybe even across the globe? Employment contracts can't be assigned, so you can't give it to another employer, although 2P does step in to override that common law principle if there's a relevant transfer. And employee obligations can't be enforced by a third party. So the employee can't substitute themselves if they don't want to undertake work. But as well as the contractual considerations, there's also some non-contractual considerations which have a legal basis underpinning them that will need to be worked through and considered in the context of agile working. So I've put up there the first one, consistency of approach. How are you going to decide who benefits from agile working and who perhaps has to come to the office more frequently? Are you going to do it based on role, or is it going to be person specific? Do watch out for potential discrimination issues that may inadvertently arise if, for example, you have a policy to say you have to have been working in the organisation for a minimum of 10 years in order to be able to have that autonomy to go out and work wherever you want. That could lead to indirect age discrimination issues. So the justification and the reasons why you're making various decisions in the context of agile working will be important if you want to avoid discrimination issues at worst, or potentially an increase in grievances if it's not clear why you are approaching things in the way that you are. So just getting those checks and balances as to what is being decided by certain managers and what might be a different response from another manager. And as Adam said, that may be down to individual managers having a little bit of fear factor and not wanting to agree to any particular different way of working, which could create some disparity within the organisation. There are other points to work through quite carefully, I think, before the agile working concept is rolled out in an organisation. Health and safety. So if you've got 5 or more employees, you'll need to undertake health and safety risk assessments. And if you have a dispersed workforce, how are you going to undertake those? How far do you need to probe with the employees where they're going to be working? You know, if we give them complete autonomy and they are working half the week in a cafe with a very inappropriate chair, for example, is that going to be your responsibility as an employer? How much do you need to know about where and how they undertake their work? If they're walking down the road approving things on an app on the school run, for example, you know, what's the risk that they cross over a road and get hit by a car whilst they're approving something? That's quite an extreme example, but you can see that there are things to work through in that context from an employer liability responsibility. Supervision. How are you going to supervise a dispersed workforce? To what extent do you need to supervise them? Now, that may be easier to do in a target-driven business, for example, where you can see the results more obviously. But there are ways that you can supervise and look at performance regardless of the role. But that needs to be worked through, and the managers need to be educated on how to undertake that. Confidentiality. How are you going to ensure that your confidential information, both as an employer and your client or customers' confidential information, is being kept secure if your workforce is dispersed, if the information is outside your office, what checks and balances are there to keep things secure? If an individual is working in a cafe using their unsecure Wi-Fi, is that a risk to the business? And what policies and procedures and checks do you need to put in place for that? I think that would be a big issue as we move forward. Insurance. Does your insurer assume that all your employees are going to be in your office? If they're dispersed, do you need to inform them of that in terms of the policy? Where are you going to display your ELI certificate if people aren't in the office? Are you going to put that up on your intranet, for example? So quite practical things to work through as well. Do the employees, are they capable of working from home if some of the time they're working from home? Do they have any mortgage restrictions on there or any covenants in their lease that would prevent this? Questions to ask when you're putting things in place. If they decide to work part of the year or most of the year from a different country, you're going to want to know that from a tax perspective. They may become tax resident there rather than in the UK. They may need visa requirements. There may then be local law issues to work through. And you may have establishment issues from a corporation tax perspective, all of which would involve a significant amount of thinking and thought and planning from your perspective. So where people work, yes, there can be autonomy, but I think you're going to need to know to some degree what the plans are. And what is the impact on salaries? Is this going to be the end of London waiting, for example, if for workers that have been in London-based roles, they've been used to having a higher salary to reflect their increased commuting costs and cost of living. If you have a dispersed workforce and there's no longer a need to live in and around London, will salaries end up levelling out? Will they be replaced with a travel allowance if the individual needs to come to the office maybe once or twice a month rather than every day? So lots of things to work through. And I know a lot of our clients are thinking about flexible working. So I'll now hand over to Adam to just talk about that in the context of Agile.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, we're just going to touch on it briefly, I think, today, because it's going to be something that people are familiar with watching this webinar. But obviously, it is still sitting underneath. And we started by looking at Agile Working. I was talking about the key distinctions and the brave new world of Agile Working. But it isn't a binary thing. It's not a case that if you have Agile, you can assume that nobody's going to raise flexible working requests or issues. So let's just look at that in the round. Obviously, it's a statutory right underpinned by statute in employment law, although it's one that has generally been met with some criticism from certain groups in terms of it perhaps lacking teeth. There isn't a clear route to compensation or remedy in the tribunal if you haven't received a flexible working request approval and you're unhappy with that. But we'll touch on that in a minute, in fact, what it means for tribunal risk. But there's a right for employees to apply for flexible working. It's a broad right. There's no longer, for a long time now, any element of it has to be a request made in certain circumstances for family reasons, etc., anything like that. But you do have to be an employee, so there's a status requirement, and you do have to have a certain minimum amount of service, 26 weeks of service, continuous service. And then you have a right under statute to make a request for a change to your terms of employment, governing how and when you work. And that isn't just about time. It isn't just saying I work full time, I want to go to part time. In fact, flexible working and the ACAS code that underpins it and guidance talks about it meaning more than that. It can be about where you work and when you work, which is why we were looking at that distinction and how do you distinguish it with Agile working. And I think it comes down to that point about actually delivering on particular tasks in the role, which is not really what flexible working is intended to cover. That's an operational and project role specific issue. There used to be a very prescriptive process to deal with flexible working requests. Steps had to be taken in a particular order in a particular way at certain times. That's been dispensed with in recent years in favour of dealing with requests in a reasonable manner. And again, that is by reference to the ACAS code, which underpins this and associated guidance. And so you have to deal with requests reasonably, which obviously means dealing with it in a broadly timely manner, considering it in the appropriate way, giving genuine thought to it, and taking care to ensure, and this links to the third of the inserted bullet points there on the slide, that if you're going to refuse a request, which you're entitled to do as an employer, you must ensure that you're doing so for one of the prescribed business reasons. In section 80G, there's a list, and that list looks at things like operational requirements. You know, will it have an impact on the ability to deliver the service that we offer to our users or customers, etc. Or in terms of managing workflows, will we have enough resource? There are different prescribed grounds. And then in addition, you have to make sure that your belief that it should be rejected for one of those prescribed reasons is based on correct facts. And so as a tribunal challenge, you can bring a challenge based on either that it was refused without one of the applicable reasons at all. The employer refused for a reason that doesn't apply and doesn't fall within section 80G 1B, and perhaps saying even if they did, it was based on incorrect facts. And essentially you're looking for a remedy from the tribunal which says that that was the case and that the matter should be considered again and should be approved unless the employer can find one of those business reasons and that there are correct facts that justify them holding the belief that it applies and should result in a refusal. So that's a very high level, very simplified summary of the law underpinning it. But of course, even if you're not eligible to make a claim, you can still make a request outside of the statutory regime. So you say you don't have 26 weeks service, you're not an employee, you might be just a worker. You can still make a request. And of course, that means that technically the code doesn't apply and the scheme doesn't apply in the strict sense, but there's still an issue there of managing those requests consistently with a view to dealing with any risk of equal treatment challenges or just grievances in general. So what about the future of flexible working? And obviously the pandemic looms large on this issue. In the last few months, we've been all doing flexible working, vast majority of us, without either party having necessarily asked for it. And in a way that's just kind of been responding to events. And in fact, in the more recent months, there's been something, in a general sense, there's been something of a flipping round of the process here where employers actually are probably more likely to have been approaching employees about flexible working in the context of saying, we need to talk about the current working arrangements, how many of those, if not all, will continue once things get back to some sense of normality, rather than the employee coming and saying, can I please agree a flexible working arrangement? And particularly so where the employer has looked and said, there are areas here of our business where flexible working is really beneficial and we don't see that there's benefit to row back from it. And the furlough scheme itself operates as a framework within which to agree a variation to an employee's contract, and the code talks about making clear to the employee it's a permanent change. And there's also a statutory rule which says you're not allowed, you don't have a right to have a further flexible work request considered within 12 months of the last one. So it's important to think about that, and touches on points Abigail made in terms of the legal issues and agreeing contractual variations. And most employees, I think, will have agreed, but that may have been up to now due to there being no alternative. The government has said you can't go into an office. Query then what that will be once the office environment is more open. Will you find that there's a very mixed picture? Some employees are saying, I'm very keen to get back into the office. And are you then trying to seek agreement with them that even if that will happen, it won't be in the same way it was before? There's a potential issue there. And in addition, if you get requests for maintained flexibility or further flexibility in the formal sense of flexible working, how easy will it be for you to refuse those on a prescribed business reason, and having been able to show we believe the continuation of this has an impact on one of those prescribed grounds that means we should refuse, in the context of somebody being able to point to the fact that they've been doing it this way for months. And if you're an employee whose objective is to get the request approved, you'd say that shows you that it works. So you can't have a proper belief on actual facts that it should be rejected for this reason, because we've been getting on fine. I think it's going to create, in a contentious situation where you can't have a meeting of minds with the employee on that, a real focus in on decisions that are around optimal position, not necessarily you know, that it can work, but actually does it work best? And how employers are going to articulate the fact that, yes, we've been able to get by with that arrangement up to now, but in terms of us agreeing a permanent flexible working arrangement going forward, ignoring any pandemic or other driving factors, here's why we say it's suboptimal. It has a negative impact, and therefore I'm afraid nonetheless, and even though we've got by doing it this way for a while, it's not something we can agree to on a formal basis. And it's also about managing what you might have quite a large flow of these requests at the same time. And so processes, how are you going to manage a large flow of them? How are you going to deal with order of priority? Is it first person to request gets priority first, and so on? You might have multiple similar requests around the same time, which you can't agree across the board. So lots of interesting issues there, probably some further detail on that for another day, but it just gives us a pickup of the flexible working context. And now I'll hand back to Abigail, who's going to do another poll for us.
Thanks, Adam. Yes, just following on from that and the consideration of office occupancy. It's something that our clients are thinking a lot about at the moment for when things start to get back to normal. And I was just interested, we were just interested to find out what you think the post-COVID office occupancy will be in your particular business. Because obviously now businesses are starting to plan for the future and whether more permanent changes will arise off the back of our largely home working for the past 9 months. So we'll just wait for those results to come through. Interesting. 73% of you believe you'll have 50% office occupancy after this, 13%, 20%, so 20% office occupancy, 11% 75% office occupancy, and just 2% back to 100% office occupancy. That's very interesting, and I think that very much aligns with a lot of the clients that we're speaking to at the moment. And I wanted to just give you a few examples of what some clients of the firm are doing in terms of changes sort of off the back of COVID, but also things that might have been in planning stages before the pandemic hit. So I've put there, first of all, a recruiter client of ours who has decided to retain their offices, but will be looking to pay for performance only in terms of their staff. These are very much draft plans. There are national minimum wage issues to work through, but the idea is that the individuals will come into the office whenever they want. There's no minimum or maximum number of days. They can take as many days holiday as they want, and as Adam touched on, that's been a reasonably familiar concept in some industries. And you know, in companies like Virgin have introduced that, and interestingly enough, I think the anecdotal evidence is people actually start to take fewer days holiday when they have an unlimited amount of holiday. So that in itself brings some challenges with how you monitor people are taking their minimum holiday requirements. But this particular organisation is wanting to remodel based on performance and having that autonomy to come and go as they please. Secondly, I've put up there a sales company who have decided that they are going to reduce their office capacity by 80%. So just have that 20% post-COVID, and have split their team of sales people into 3 groups. They will then have daily Zoom calls to discuss work. And then on the days that they're not having those Zoom calls, they will attend the office on a rota basis to have face-to-face meetings. So this particular organisation has used COVID to disperse their workforce permanently and change their working practices. Now that's quite an extreme, permanent change. Other clients of ours are doing things on slightly more temporary trial bases. So to say, well, look, we think that this type of working arrangement is working well at the moment, but things may change. We can't, this is all still, we're all still feeling our way through what's been happening this year, and also what might happen in the future. And so there's been a side letter or a temporary variation for 6 months, let's say, for a trial as to different working practices, so that the employer and the employee can see how things are working. And then finally, an example, probably a more extreme example of how agile working can work in practice, from a company based in Australia who provide coaching services to university and school students whose first language isn't English. The students will submit an essay to a website, and then the company has a bank of tutors from across the globe who will look at the work and mark it on the English side of things, so the grammar, the spelling, etc., before it's then submitted by the student to their university or school. All work is submitted into a pool. It's given a value and a fee, which is primarily based on the length of the document. And then the tutor from anywhere in the world will select that piece of work if they're interested in it, and they have a minimum, they have a time limit for undertaking and marking that work. There's an online chat room that's been developed for the tutors to support each other. That's set up by the company, but tutors aren't paid to support. They support voluntarily if there's any issues. And all the recruitment of the tutors is done online, and there's an online induction. But because there is that online support through the chat room, the tutors feel supported. The employer has access to a global talent pool at minimal cost, and they can monitor quality through feedback from the students on the pieces of work. But interestingly, in this example, there's not a word spoken between the company and the worker, or the worker and the students. So it's all done completely remotely. And it's a real example of how an organisation has looked at their processes and created a platform through Agile Working to address and support the processes. So there's just a couple of questions that I wanted to do very quickly on Agile Working that have come through. One person's asked, if we change our working arrangements to allow for Agile Working, should we issue a new contract? And I think that very much depends on the extent of the change. If they're wholesale changes, then I think a new contract makes sense. If you want to do things on a temporary basis, or there are minimal changes, I think a side letter or a contract variation would be appropriate. And then Adam, just one very quickly for you. Do we need to change any particular, or do we need to have any particular policies if we have a dispersed workforce?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the answer is, I suspect in most instances, yes, that's going to be important and useful. What it says and does, I think, will be specific to perhaps the sector, perhaps the type of work that the organisation does, but also perhaps even the parts of the organisation that are using Agile Working. It'll be one way, I think, in which you try to manage a loss of control over Agile Working, and to put some checks and balances in to ensure that you do retain some overall structure and comfort around people going off on frolics of their own, etc.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Okay, so I'm very conscious of time. This is the slightly shorter section of the webinar, but what I want to do now is just move on to furlough and alternatives. So we're looking at the sort of immediate term now. So looking at furlough, the first thing, I know I've said up there furlough post-November the 1st. The first thing I did was want to highlight is the deadline for claims under the previous furlough scheme that ended on the 31st of October. The deadline for getting those grants in is the 30th of November. So do just keep an eye on that deadline if you have outstanding claims. But as you know, the coronavirus job retention scheme has been extended to the 31st of March, or the furlough scheme as we call it. The job retention bonus is on hold, and the job support scheme that had been introduced or advertised has been postponed. Employers can currently claim up to 80% of the employee's salaries, up to £2,500 a month. That may well change next year. At the moment, it's just for the next few months, but the government have said they're going to review that in January, so that may well change. Employer NI and pension contributions are still payable, and it's open to all employers, even those who've not used the furlough scheme before. But do be aware that the Treasury guidance is very clear on the stated purpose of the furlough scheme. So it talks about only using it where employment activities have been impacted by coronavirus or measures taken to stop the spread. It's not clear how HMRC are going to police that, but I would say you are going to want to have some evidence that you could demonstrate, if challenged, as to how your organisation has been impacted by coronavirus before you then use the scheme. There's no limit on the number of staff who can be furloughed, but they do have to have been on your PAYE payroll on the 30th of October, and you must have made an RTI submission between the 20th of March and the 30th of October. Flexible furlough remains an option, and that needs to be for a minimum period of 7 calendar days. Moving on, interestingly enough, from December, HMRC have said that they will publish the names of companies and LLPs who make claims and either the claim amount or a reasonable indication of the amount claimed. So I think that's trying to be a bit of a disincentive for perhaps larger organisations who don't really need to use the scheme but have thought it's a kind of nice to have. There's a little bit of additional pressure, I think, being put on them by HMRC there. Agreements must be in place before the relevant claim period. There was a short window for backdating claims, but that has now passed. So make sure you get your agreement in place before you put people on furlough. And as I said, it will be reviewed next year, and you may be asked to contribute more as an employer. Crucially, with this new extended scheme, notice can't be claimed for any day that an employee is serving contractual or statutory notice from the 1st of December to the 31st of January, but I expect this will be extended beyond the 31st of January. Currently, we only have the guidance up until then, but I fully expect that to be extended. And it's not just employees that you've made redundant. This would also bite if an employee on furlough resigned. So there is a potential additional cost to businesses there, even if they're not intending to make any dismissals. And I've said broadly their claims need to be submitted within a couple of weeks. But on the whole, it's very similar to the previous furlough scheme, but with those slight, subtle, but nevertheless very important changes for employers. What I'll do now, just very quickly for the last 5 minutes, is hand over to Adam to look at some other options if you are wanting to look at the way that you're working over the next few months.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Obviously not the most happy of subjects, this first one, in terms of redundancies, but I'm sure people watching this will have seen in the press recently, in the run-up to the end of November, some statistics around redundancy numbers increasing again, and I think that's perhaps in part to do with employers recognising that from December the furlough scheme won't cover a proportion of notice pay, and so employers in some instances are seeking to get notice of termination underway and benefit from the scheme as much as they can or could up to the end of November. But of course that is an option for employers, redundancies, if there is a necessity for it, in the negative sense that work has dropped off so much due to the pandemic that there's a need to do that to save costs and to survive, or in a more, if you can make redundancies positive, in a slightly more positive context, that the business has become so much more optimized, agile and effective in what it does, and uses technology so effectively that it has a differing need for employees, either reduction overall in the numbers, or just that employees are needed in different roles in different parts of the business. So for any employees who've got 2 years continuous service or more, of course, you have to think about unfair dismissal rights, and you have to factor in the statutory redundancy pay entitlements they will have unless you successfully go through the suitable alternative employment regime, so that either they're not redundant, or you can show that they've unreasonably rejected such SAE or suitable alternative employment. The hallmarks of the process, of course, are to put the appropriate, in inverted commas, employees at risk and go through a consultation process around the situation and what it means or is proposed to mean for individuals and their roles. Issues that arise that you need to think about obviously include pooling and selection. Pooling being, how do we identify the groups of employees that should be in an at-risk pool together? Is it everyone that's at risk at this time? Is it grouped into different areas and different people together due to seniority, role type, all manner of different rules? There's a fairly broad margin of discretion for employers on how they choose pooling. It needs to make logical sense and not be perverse, but otherwise there's quite a large degree of discretion on that. And then selection, the hallmarks of selection processes for those with dismissal, unfair dismissal rights is objective criteria, objectively applied. There will always usually be some subjectivity in those two elements, but it's the ideal outcome is to minimize that as much as possible. So you have to go through that process, unless you are just closing down an entire location within the business or an entire type of work and role, so that there's no selection to be done. It's anybody in that role or that location. Do you invite volunteers for redundancy from elsewhere in the business? It may be a way of avoiding compulsory redundancies. And if you are going to do that, do you invite them before and as a precursor to a process, in the sense that if we get enough volunteers, we may not have to do anything? Or do you do it alongside? There are practical pros and cons to those things that need to be considered. But be mindful of collective consultation under the Trade Union Labour Relations Act and legislation, and the need to avoid inadvertently triggering that, because it involves a group consultation with elected representatives if you don't have an existing body, and minimum periods of collective consultation before you can move into issuing or certainly terminating employments. And that also gives rise to protective award claims potentially, which can be up to 12 weeks or 90 days, but effectively 3 months gross pay per affected employee if collective duties had been engaged and you failed to follow the requirements. And bear in mind that those are essentially speaking triggered, those collective consultation duties, if you're proposing to dismiss as redundant, and I'll come back to what redundant means for these particular purposes in a moment, 20 or more people in a 90-day window. Now, redundant for these purposes has a broader meaning than the meaning under the unfair dismissal regime. It's effectively any non-personal dismissal or dismissal for non-personal reasons. So you need to be mindful of the fact that you might have 17 redundancy, as you would typically understand it, dismissals in a particular establishment or the business. And we do look at establishment as the context within which you assess numbers that might be independently operating parts of your business rather than the whole operation. You have 17 typical redundancy type dismissals, and you know they're in your numbers of the proposals and they're all happening within 90 days. But then there are 3 or 4 other dismissals happening which aren't actually being presented as redundancies per se, but they aren't about the personal performance or circumstances of the individual. If there are those as well, they will have tipped your number over to the 20 or more and trigger the duty. So do keep that in mind. It's one of the most expensive parts of the employment law regime to get wrong in terms of those big protective awards for every affected employee. So that redundancies is clearly an option. There's also layoff and short time working. If you have the contractual right, and going into lockdown, In certain sectors, it was quite common, but probably the vast majority of employers didn't have wordings in their contracts that allowed them to lay people off or put them on short-time working. If you do have them and are thinking of using them, how long do you lay off people for? Well, that's an issue for you internally, but be aware that employees can claim statutory redundancy pay and treat their employment as an end if they're laid off or on short-time working for 4 or more consecutive weeks, or 6 weeks where there's no more than 3 consecutive weeks in any period of 13. So you can have combinations of layoff or short-time working that can trigger, perhaps inadvertently, statutory redundancy pay obligations. But there is a counter notice regime for employers to seek the return of the employee within 4 weeks. But it raises that question mark of whether you can, whether that might be triggered. And also the question mark of whether employees are then able to enforce enhanced redundancy payments using this mechanism. If you have an enhanced scheme that you apply in circumstances of redundancy, and whether it's stated to be contractual or not, if it's been going on for a long time, it's notorious and certain, does the definition of redundancy that triggers that enhanced entitlement distinguish between layoff and short-time arrangements and what we might say is more traditional redundancy situation? If it doesn't, you perhaps have to look at whether there's arguably a duty to provide the enhanced payment in these circumstances. So these are tools that can be used. We just need to be mindful of how they operate and have in mind the potential circumstances or consequences. And unpaid leave. I think in the lockdown scenario we've been in, particularly for businesses where they've been hard hit by lockdown, there's probably been a greater willingness on the part of employees to accept and agree to arrangements which are not beneficial to them, like a period of unpaid leave. Query how long that will last as things start to improve or individual circumstances and options become better. Will that remain the case? People may be more reluctant, but of course, if you're putting someone on unpaid leave, it's unlikely you've got any contractual power to do it unilaterally and just do it. You'd need their consent. And think about the costs. If they're on unpaid leave, they're still employed, so they're still accruing holiday, and they probably are accruing other benefits unless you address that. You also need to think of practical issues like keeping in touch and IT access. But this could be a helpful method to avoid other harsher measures if you can reach agreement with your staff on them. So that's just a few things to think about there in the wider context of post pandemic and furlough. And reskilling, if you do still have needs in the business, and indeed if parts of your business are actually busier than ever, perhaps the thing to do is to look at reskilling and moving resource around the business rather than having the cost of, say, redundancies and then hiring in new joiners to pick it up. If you're going to do that, is it temporary or permanent? Again, almost certainly you would need to seek consent if it's a fundamental change in role, not one that the contract empowers you to make yourself unilaterally. And if it's a cost to do that, reskilling, retraining, do you want to tie them in or seek to tie them in by saying if you leave within a certain period, you have to pay back some of that, and make sure you avoid unenforceable penalty clauses in that regard. So yes, a few bits of food for thought there, hopefully, Abigail.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. We've got, I know, just a very, very short window for a couple of questions, but there are a few that have come in. One about furloughing clinically extremely vulnerable individuals post 2nd of December, when doesn't appear to be any clear guidance. I think the answer to that is, can you continue to do it under the furlough scheme, is yes, the tiered system will feed into that, and I think the government have said they will publish more guidance towards the end of this current lockdown period. But the furlough scheme is open if an individual cannot work from the office and it is unsafe for them to work from home, and it's unsafe, or they feel it's unsafe, or you feel it's unsafe, or the government advises they don't come into the office, then you can continue to furlough them under the scheme if they provide consent to that. Another question that's come in, Adam, I think you could answer this. How is layoff different from furlough?
Yes, I saw that. Yes, the question come through in the chat forum there. Yeah, well, I think the key distinction is layoff is entirely private. I don't want to confuse things given that, admittedly, often it's in the context of sectors and employers who've got trade union relations, as well, because you've seen it typically in manufacturing, engineering, that sort of thing. But it is essentially a private arrangement between the employer and the employee through the contract of employment that allows for the unilateral stopping of work for individuals within the statutory constraints of the scheme for certain limited periods, after which you'll trigger the individual's right to say, well, no, you've made me redundant. And so it's a private contractual structure underpinned by a bit of statute. Clearly, the key distinction is there isn't a government support arrangement or financial backing for it, underpinning it. It leaves the employee with no much reduced pay arrangement.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm very conscious it's 11 o'clock, so what we will do is we will pull together all the questions and send out a Q&A sheet. But thank you very much for joining us.